Okay, that's great. There's a few people making noise. Let me just mute everybody. Perfect, thanks very much. Welcome to the third of these 3 sessions on scientific writing. I've almost gone slower than I should have done through the last couple, so we may have to schedule some more of these in future. But I'll try and get through the prepared material that I have for today's session. Then perhaps, I'm aware there's there's lots of really interesting questions that maybe I haven't fully covered in the sessions that are appearing on the Google sheet. And just to remind you, there's a Google document here. I'm posting the link into the chat. This is a place where you can share any questions that you might have about scientific writing. And especially at this point, things that, you know, or at least by the end of today, things that haven't been covered that you would like to see covered. If I haven't covered them, we can come back to them in another session a bit later on. I'm going on holiday for a couple of weeks after this, but as soon as I'm back, I can do another session and cover off on any remaining questions that people have and issues that people would like to see covered. So please do add in questions that you have into that Google Doc, and in the fullness of time, we can make sure all those questions are covered. Great. And we finished Wednesday's session with some, I suppose, virtual non-compulsory homework. You know, I encouraged everyone to write a bold paragraph for your next paper or thesis chapter that you're working on. We looked at the Nature bold paragraph as a kind of template for an abstract for papers, and usefully the Nature editors have really broken down sentence by sentence that bold paragraph. But we also thought about it as a much more deeply useful tool than simply an abstract template, and that actually one could think about it as a template for the logic of an entire paper, and really use it to help ground and figure out what your entire paper is about, what logical structure your paper is going to take, and all of the relevant argumentation that you might need. So I really do encourage you, if you're trying to write something, you know, you've hit a block, we all do that, you're confused, you're not sure what's going on, you can't really remember what what you're really aiming for. Have a go at just starting with a blank sheet, writing out a Nature bold paragraph, and seeing if that helps you, you know, really pull together the story of your paper. You know, writing has so many different elements to it. There's the technical part, getting the detail right, but perhaps more importantly, there's the sort of fundamental part of getting the overall structure of your paper clear and getting the thoughts logically clear in your head, so that you can then transfer that thinking to someone else through the medium of writing. Great, someone's already said, Michael's kindly said he already started to use it and found that a useful you know, exercise to do that. So I do encourage you to do it. It's not hugely time consuming, and you may find it very useful. And who knows, you may end up sending your paper to Nature, in which case you've already begun work on it. Okay, I want to move on through the structure of the scientific paper. And of course, what comes next after an abstract is typically the introduction. And this kind of really applies to almost any kind of paper that you would write, whether it's a review paper, even most commentaries, pretty much any piece of writing needs to begin with some statements that deal with these kinds of topics. My thoughts on this are that the introduction needs to as broad as to define as broadly as possible the issue or problem that you're referring to and tackling in your paper. And that word broad is important. You know, you've got to convince somebody that the issue tackled in your paper is something that they might be interested in, right? And we spoke a bit about this last time. You don't need to overdo it. You don't need to overgeneralize or overstate the generality of your problem, but you must kind of define a broad issue in which your study sits. You know, is it tackling an important global change issue? Is it a kind of deep, unresolved question in evolutionary biology? You know, what's the broad issue that you're placing your paper within? What do we know about the topic so far? You know, can you go through some of the key pieces of understanding that we currently have about the topic? Try not to do it as a kind of dry literature review, talking through individual papers, but try to talk about it thematically. You know, what do we know so far? What are the things we know? And then consequent to that, where are some of the important gaps in our knowledge about the particular topic? And of course, this is critical. This is the critical part of an introduction. You've got to lead the reader along to the point where they can see what you can see, that there's a gap in the literature. And it's important that your logic in the introduction leads up to that point where you're identifying and setting out that particular gap. You've got to convince the reader that, first of all, that, you know, there is a gap in our knowledge or understanding, and that secondly, it's important to fill that gap. You know, that if we knew this, then we could do this, or then that would, you know, answer a long-standing question. So the introduction must logically lead to that point where you identify a gap. That's the heart of the introduction, that third bullet point there. And the sentences before that point need to lead up to identifying that gap. So saying what we do know and then pointing out some things that we don't know. It could just be one thing, or it could be a couple of different things. And of course, those are the points that you're going to be tackling in your paper. So then you need to sort of say how you're going to fill that gap with your research that you're communicating in the paper. You know, and that's where you may have a paragraph that begins, you know, in this paper we, or here we, you know, what do you do? What are you doing in this paper to fill the research gap that you've identified? A quick word about hypotheses. I'm aware this is a broad audience that's tuning in to these sessions. Thinking broadly across different disciplines, sometimes you may well need formal hypotheses. You may have a very particular experimental design that has a very clear hypothesis that you're looking to test. Sometimes, and quite often, if you think about the full breadth of the scientific literature, you may not need a hypothesis, or you may not need to describe what you're doing in terms of a formal hypothesis. This is particularly frequently the case in conservation science, where I work, but there are many sort of disciplines and many papers within many disciplines that don't need formal hypothesis-like language. And so sort of think about whether or not a formal hypothesis framework is useful for you. Most importantly, you've got to state the research gap. And in some cases, it's just something we don't know. And you need to describe how you're going to fill that gap. You may wish to use terminology around research questions. You may have a set of research questions that your paper is tackling. You may call them aims or objectives or whatever. but ultimately many introductions embed a list of 2 or 3 or 4 research questions. And it is surprising how often one comes across introductions that don't very clearly say what the specific research questions of the paper are. Sometimes introductions just kind of, maybe they introduce it, they maybe state a research gap, but don't very clearly say exactly what questions the paper is going to tackle to fill that research gap. And I kind of think that's a mistake. I think it's important to set out very clearly what your research aims are. And I often end up using a list, 1, 2, 3 in a list, and you're actually saying what those research questions are. Now, importantly, the structure that you set up in that part of the introduction echoes throughout the entire paper. Often your research questions they need to be in a logical order. So for example, you might be describing a pattern. You might then be analysing what gives rise to that pattern, for example. So there's a kind of logical flow to that. First is the more basic description. Second, maybe some more detail that sort of analyses how that pattern came about, or builds statistical models or whatever. That sets up a kind of logic of increasing complexity, maybe documenting something first and then analysing something second. If you can set up that clear logic with your research questions in the introduction, the reader is then primed to follow that logic and expect that logic through the rest of the paper. So when you come to the methods, you would expect the methods to also be set out in that logical way, in the same way that the original aims have been set out. You would expect the results section to also follow through in the same way. In the example I just gave, your results may begin with that description of a pattern and then may go on to do some statistical analyses or modelling of predictors of that pattern, for example. Okay, so I think it's important that the logic that you set out in the introduction is then echoed through the rest of the paper. That helps the reader. They only have to understand your logic once, and then they can follow that same logic through in the other sections of the paper. This one's a little bit more, people think about this final point a bit more variably. I'm never afraid to give the game away at the end of the introduction. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example of one of these final paragraphs in an introduction where one sets out the aims of a paper. So in this particular paper, there's 2 aims in this paper, right? I'd noticed that this paragraph here is the kind of here we paragraph that comes at the end of an introduction. So there's been a sort of review of literature, there's been an identification of the research gap in the introduction prior to this, and this is that last paragraph. There's 2 aims. We develop models of shorebird occupancy and abundance. Second, we use these to build a zoning plan, right? So there's 2 aims in this paper. Those aims are clearly signposted and flagged by this logic. There are 2 of them. One comes first, one comes second, and then we follow that same logic in the methods and in the results. The discussion, it can be separate. It doesn't need to be crafted in quite the same way, but introduction, methods, results are going to follow this same logic, building the models first, then using the models to build a plan. Here's the paragraph the sentence I'm talking about that gives the game away. And what I mean by that is it basically tells the reader at this point, at the end of the introduction, what the results are. Now, that different people have strong views on this. Some people say you should never do this. and that the introduction should finish before this. You shouldn't have this sentence at the end of an introduction. I find I like doing things like this. I like to have this at the end of the introduction. Part of the reason is I think people don't always read papers all the way through. And I think if you've crafted your introduction well, it will be almost kind of obvious in many ways what your results are going to be, because your introduction should be foreshadowing your paper. It should be quite clearly setting out the direction that the paper's going. I find that we're not writing a suspense novel. We're not necessarily trying to keep the reader in a state of suspense until the big reveal in the results section. The paper as a whole is trying to communicate the story to the reader. And I think by the time you get to the end of the introduction, the reader should be pretty clear what you're trying to find and should be ready to know what the answer is. And then they can go into the methods with that in their mind and evaluating what the methods say. Now, don't take this as a piece of gospel advice that you must always do this. Some journals don't like it. You may not like it. So there's no need to do it if you don't think it's something that's worthwhile doing. And be aware that sometimes journal editors and referees don't like this. Maybe what you should do is next time you read some papers, have a look at whether the introduction includes this kind of sentence near the end and see if you find it useful or not. So I'm just putting it out there. I'm not recommending you do it. I just wanted to plant the idea in your mind. Okay, any questions at this point about methods? Either put your hand up or write in the chat. About introduction, sorry. Okay. All right, let's move on. Methods. There's a common misconception, I think, that you can write methods first. To a certain extent it's true, but there's no way that you can write an entire method section first as the first thing you do with a paper. And the reason for that is everything we've talked about so far. When you write a paper, you've got to think about the whole thing. You've got to think about the logic of everything. You've got to think about exactly what your research questions are, what pieces of information are going to go into the argumentation in the paper. And so that means you can't, with very few exceptions, you can't know for sure exactly what elements of the methods you're going to need to emphasize, or what order you're going to put them in until you kind of know the whole story of the paper. So I think there may be some elements of methods that are quite kind of easy to write and you can write them fairly early. But in terms of crafting the whole method section, it has to be an integral part of the rest of the paper. It can't just be written on its own and sort of shoved in a drawer and forget about it. It's got to be crafted and developed along with the rest of the paper. Really for two ultimate reasons. You have to know what you need to include in the methods to sort of tell the full story of your paper. And you really need to make sure that the logic of the methods follows the logic that you set up in the introduction and that you're then going to follow through with in your results section. Just opening the chat there. Quick question there about the introduction. Yeah, so some different viewpoints on whether the main findings should be mentioned in the introduction or not. the questioner says, well, maybe you shouldn't mention it in the introduction, because at that point, you haven't done any analysis. You can't really substantiate any findings that you talk about at the end of the introduction. And for sure, I fully appreciate that viewpoint. And certainly if one doesn't wish to do it, there's absolutely no need to do it. I think my view is that in that brief statement at the end of the introduction, you're simply saying, giving a quick summary of what the rest of the paper is going to go on to show. So you're not really making a claim at that point, you're simply summarizing what the rest of the paper goes on to do. Okay. So methods. The aim of the methods is to get the reader absolutely primed and ready for the answers that are going to follow in the results section. It's absolutely critical that the methods section has a clear logical flow. And for this reason, I often find the methods section the hardest section to write of papers, and that may surprise you. Methods should be easy, right? You're just describing what you did. Actually, no, the methods section is much deeper than that. The methods section sets out the logical flow of the material and the data and the analyses that you need to tackle your research questions. If you write the methods section well, it's not just the chronological description of what you did and when you did it. It's actually a logical flowing description of all the pieces of the puzzle that you need to build up the picture which you're going to go through in the results section. It's very difficult because the methods section, and all writing of course is linear. You have to write it linear, but often in methods there are several pieces that we need to talk about to kind of move forward. So it can be really difficult to know what the correct sequence of introducing material into the methods actually is. And for that reason, I find the methods section often really quite difficult. It varies from paper to paper. Sometimes it's sort of pretty straightforward. If you've, I don't know, delivered a questionnaire or there's one main experiment, that may be more straightforward. If you have an analysis that uses multiple different kinds of approaches, different sorts of data, can be really difficult. Somebody suggested in the chat a really useful suggestion there of an overview section at the start of the methods that perhaps sets, in more complex cases, sets out the structure. And that is a very useful device. I think that's a great suggestion there from Kay, that you may have a section at the beginning that says, our analysis is composed of 3 parts. First, the data on this, second, the analysis with that, third, we build a model. And so a kind of introductory sentence to the methods that then it gives the reader the signpost they need to help them navigate through the methods. So I completely agree. I think that's a very useful device in situations where the methods are more complex. In general, I think the basic rule for methods, and really by extension then for logic in scientific papers, because remember, the logic from the introduction, methods and results should be the same flowing logic. In general, begin with simpler material, foundational material, descriptive material, then move on to modeling and analysis and more kind of derived or second order material later on. That, I think, helps. It just helps in so many ways. I think a reader becomes familiar with the basic structure of data and the sort of basic questions. Then they're equipped to tackle in their mind the more complicated modeling or comparing of variables and so on. So if you're struggling to think of logic, perhaps have a think about the rule, start simple, then add complexity as you move through the methods. And if you struggle with logic when you're in the methods, you know, maybe have a look at your introduction and see if you can borrow logical flow and from each other. And at the end, you have to synchronize all of that logical flow in all three sections: intro, methods, and results. Some very basic things, but these are things that I've kind of, you know, noticed are missing from many method sections. Yeah, exactly where did you get your data from? Sometimes some of this is unclear. What's the absolute origin of the data? How were data originally collected? This is especially important in cases where you've used, you know, third-party data sets, the data that originated from other sources. And again, this is, you know, it's an old chestnut. You learnt this one at school. Write it so that your study can be replicated. You know, and again, this is often a shortfall. And I appreciate it can be very difficult, and it's becoming increasingly difficult, I think, with more and more complexity in our papers, bigger and bigger data sets. You know, it's now becoming much more common to upload code and data to allow full replication of the analysis and the workflows that are included in a paper. And I think for the most complex papers, that kind of full reproducibility is absolutely worthwhile. Of course, slightly terrifying, because we're kind of opening up and everything we do is then open to you know, detailed review. But ultimately, that's, I think, how it should be. And if that's done in a spirit of transparency, and we've done our best and really tried to bring the highest quality analysis to bear on a particular data set, you know, we needn't be afraid of doing that. So as a bare minimum, we must write it so the study could be replicated. And in some circumstances, we may want to upload code and go for full reproducibility. Okay. Anything else on methods before I move on to results? Okay. All right. Yeah, useful question there about what should go into supplementary material instead of main methods. Really good point. I mean, increasingly, our papers are having longer and longer supplementary sections. I think, I mean, it's going to be hard, it's hard to provide a single sort of clear answer to that question. I mean, as a general rule, I guess, anything that's fundamental to the logic or is a piece of the puzzle which is going to be, you know, carried through and really talked about in the results has to be underpinned by methods in the main manuscript. Supplementary is very useful for additional analyses, things like sensitivity analyses, describing how simulations are done, or especially where those are additional and kind of backing up or checking something in the main analysis, or checking assumptions or looking for errors or biases or that kind of stuff, where really all you might refer to in the main method section is that you know, those biases were minimal or whatever it might be. So those things could be usefully put in supplementary information. In some cases, where the underlying data, where there's a big story to tell around that, you may want to have a supplementary section that talks in detail about the source of some of the data and goes through you know, some of that kind of material. it's a bit difficult because there are many different circumstances where you might want to put material in supplementary versus the main methods. So really it's a case of, I think, evaluating each part of the methods and deciding whether it really belongs in the main story or not. If you have a section that's really distracting and just seems very minor and it's just really distracting the logic of the methods, that might be a clue that it could go into supplementary. So no easy answers there. Someone's asking about the sort of difference between appendix and supplementary files and supplementary information. There's so many different names for all of these things. That's very much down to the journal in question, and you need to consult very carefully with the journal in question, the author guidelines of that journal, to know how to refer to and how to structure your supplementary sections. Most journals, well, all journals have very clear guidance about that. And also look at other papers in those journals and see how they've dealt with it. If you're writing a thesis, of course, there should be guidelines around different sections of the thesis and so on. Okay, keen to move on. Results section, I've echoed this now already, and I will say it again because I think it's extremely important. Really, by now, you're relaxing, you're following the same logic that you've already outlined and been through twice, first in the introduction and then in the methods. By now, the reader should be, the logic of your paper should be so ingrained in the reader's mind that they're really ready for the results now, and they know what order they're going to come in, and they've got the scaffolding in their mind that they can then place the results into. Again, echoing previous advice in previous sections, begin with simpler results and then move on to more complicated or derived or second order results. The results section in general doesn't need to start with a splash. It needs to build logic in the same way that the previous sections have used, with some exceptions. Yeah, Jutta asks that exact question, shouldn't we put the most important result first to underline its importance? In general, I would argue no, because I think the results section needs to build the logic in the same way that the research questions have been set out at the beginning. And I think in most cases, that should be a building logic, not starting with the important and then tailing away through the results section. There are some exceptions to this. Nature and science papers are one example, I think, where you may well punch out with the most important result first, and then follow up with kind of additional results or developments after that. But in situations where you do that, the introductory material, needs to reflect that logic. So I think crucially, it's important not to suddenly start a whole new logical flow when you get into the results section. I think that can create a lot of difficulty in the reader's mind, because they've then got to navigate a whole new logical development. In the results section, now this is, I suppose, just a general call for letting data talk. There's no need to over-analyse stuff. I think sometimes, and this applies particularly to the sort of applied ecological, the applied sciences in particular, sometimes there's a tendency to sort of statistically analyse to death every single pattern or difference that one might see in data. And I encourage you, I think, to think carefully about when you need to statistically analyse and test things, and when you can just let the data speak and let some of the patterns speak for themselves. I think some of the most excruciating papers are ones where there's, you know, parentheses every fourth word that have, you know, detailed statistical results in them. And you kind of end up with the sense that if you're that reliant on the results of statistical testing, perhaps there's no real strong patterns in the data anyway. So think about letting the data shine and letting the data speak, and then using analysis for those critical points that you want to make. Crucially, and again, this one is controversial again, but I feel more strongly about this one, and I would consider this a piece of advice. Don't just include results. There has to be, I think, and this is my view, some of you may disagree, I think there has to be interpretation sentences that help the reader navigate their way through the results section. And I'm going to give, I hope, in the next slide, some examples of this. Okay, here's some writing. The content doesn't matter, so don't try to read it or worry too much about it. I want you to look at the, I should have highlighted this. The last sentence, there's a sentence that begins, these results suggest, right? And I think sentences like that, I think, are really useful and important. So the first couple of sentences that you can see here give actual results. They just talk about results. They say that this is significantly bigger than that, or blah, 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 and refers out to some analysis, that results that are given in some tables. But that third sentence is interpretation. Now, you know, strictly speaking, according to your high school or perhaps undergraduate education, you would have been told not to include the third sentence because it's interpreting the results and not just giving results. Now, but, you know, I have a problem with that because I think it's difficult as a reader to grasp the significance of individual results unless we get a bit of help from the author at the moment that that result is talked about. So I think interpretation sentences like this, these results suggest or show or indicate or demonstrate, I think those words are useful because it helps the reader kind of get a bit of closure on a result and go, yeah, okay, I see what they're, you know, claiming that that result is showing, and I either agree or I disagree with that. If you just present the bare results, the reader has to somehow try to remember and hold all of those results in their memory until they get to the discussion when they learn what you're kind of claiming from those results. I hope I've described that clearly. That's my kind of viewpoint on that issue. And really useful question, point raised in the chat, isn't this a bit repetitive if you're then going to come back to that in the discussion? And that's a really great point. And my answer to that question is, yes, it is, and no, it isn't. Of course, it is slightly repetitive in the sense that you're going to revisit that point in the discussion. These results suggest that, whatever it is. You're essentially going to revisit that and make that point again in the discussion. But of course, in the discussion, what was a brief sentence here is going to be 3 or 4 paragraphs in the discussion where you really, you know, deeply go into that claim or conclusion that you're making from those results. So instead of being repetition, I view this kind of sentence in results as being a primer that then when the reader gets to the discussion, they then sort of remember and understand the logic that led to your conclusions. So that's my take on that topic. Again, and as with all of these things, there are exceptions. And there are cases where it doesn't quite work, or there are particular results where you don't need to do that, and so on. So I think, you know, takes these suggestions on board and see if they may be useful in certain cases. Okay. I don't know why I'm showing this. So here I had a more detailed go through that text, which we don't need to do now. Okay, quick note on figures and tables. Often I find maps are poorly used in spatial papers. Maps can be an enormous waste of space if they're not particularly information heavy, or they can be incredibly compelling if they're well constructed and, you know, contain really important data. So I encourage you, when you have spatial data of any kind, to think about maps. I think they're incredibly, I don't know, as human beings, I think we're very compelled by maps, and I think they can be incredibly useful devices in papers that have any spatial component to them at all. Usual advice, and you would have heard this in high school and undergraduate, you know, but again, you often see these rules being flouted, and I think these are basic rules. Graphs for simple data, tables for more complex information. And remember, a graph is to help the reader see patterns or differences or relationships in the data. Graphs are not for exhaustive reporting of a data set, right? Graphs are absolutely summary tools to enable a reader to see differences and patterns in data. So they need to be used in ways that the differences or pattern that you're trying to emphasize is immediately obvious and comes out of the graph. Incredibly complex graph with lots of, you know, different bits to it, and it's just hard. They just don't really tell you very much. So I would rather see several graphs, each one of which makes a very clear point, rather than one enormously complicated one. And in some cases, I may prefer a table instead of a graph if the information is that kind of lengthy or complex. Tables, of course, are useful for more complex, more multidimensional information, particularly, of course, results of tests or models. And if you have sort of summaries of data grouped by various things and so on. And, you know, there's obviously no need to repeat between display items, between graphs and tables. And there's also no need to repeat data that is in a table. So, for example, going back to here, this results paragraph that we looked at earlier, you know, you can see that it's almost all words in here, even though we're referring out to some complicated models that underpinned these results. We're allowing the statistically interested reader to go look at table 2 and digest table 2 and look at all the numbers and, you know, look at the table caption and refer back to the methods and really dig into the model. Or the reader who doesn't really care about that can just read straight through and not be too distracted by all the detail. So you don't need to put detailed statistical results. If you can get them in a table somewhere else, that can help free up your results section to be mostly words, which is more pleasurable for people to read. Okay. Time is moving on. I will spend a bit of time going through the discussion now. Really, by now, you'll be racing in your paper. You've covered your intro, methods and results have all had that same logical structure. But now I think crucially, you have, this comes back to Yutta's question about the main results. In general, and once again, there are heaps of exceptions, but in general, I think the discussion can and should begin with the main results. now I think you're partially freed from your logic of analysis that you've used for your paper so far, and you can now start to talk about your findings in order of importance. I think typically the discussion would begin with the most important finding and what that all means. You may wish to use the same logical structure you've had before, but in some cases you may want a different one. Kind of depends on case by case, but for sure the discussion really should begin almost always with the most important material first. And if you're stuck, people often get a bit stuck, I think, with the discussion. It's like, what do I do now? I've kind of done the whole thing already. Anything I write now is going to be a repeat of what I've already written. And to a certain extent, that's true, but it's an amplification of your results. What was your result? But really, why does it matter? What's changed now? How has the world changed as, you know, or our interpretation of a theory or our knowledge about a subject? How has it moved on now as a result of that finding? What additional questions are arising from that? How could that result actually change things in terms of theory in a field, or perhaps practice if we're talking about an applied paper? And you know, you can step through, I think, the results in this kind of way. And here you're talking about 1, 2, or 3 paragraphs even for each of your major results. And these results, I think, should of course echo your original research questions, but you may be tackling them in a different order now in the results section. Importantly, in the discussion, it really is critical to talk about limitations, right? None of our studies are perfect. There may be difficulties of interpretation of certain data sets. You know, it may be unclear how generalizable some of our findings are. There may need to be further replication, for example. You know, we just don't, we're never going to, no study's perfect. And it's important to show the reader that you're aware of that, I think. And I mean, don't go overboard. I mean, we all know that no study's perfect. So, you know, you don't need to self-flagellate to a great extent in the discussion. But I think it's important to set out that you know what some of the difficulties with the discussion, with the analysis and paper might be. And frame them positively. You know, perhaps you know there's biases in the data you've used, but it's the best possible data that's available. And, you know, perhaps it would be great to have further data collection that it tries to minimize those biases or whatever. You know, then are there positive things you can suggest that would deal with some of those limitations? Is it important that, you know, we take that result, but do we need to think of it as provisional until there's further replication or until it's tested in a different setting or whatever? Could there be some contextual reason why some of the results were the way they were? And there's a useful question at this point, you know, would we mention those limitations at the end of the discussion almost in its own section, or per result? That's a really good question, and my general feeling on that is that I prefer it to be interwoven within you know, all the way through the discussion section. To be honest, I don't really like limitations sections. You know, I find it unhelpfully explicit in saying, right, here's a whole giant 2 paragraphs of stuff that's wrong with the paper, and you know, I don't think that's useful. I think it's better to talk about those limitations or challenges at each point in the discussion where that particular limitation is relevant. In general, I prefer that kind of structure. And that's not to disguise them or to try to hide them, but it's to get them into the discussion at a relevant point. When the reader's thinking, right, you know, how do I make use of this information now? How do I think about it in terms of other systems or other questions that I might ask? You know, could you use it as a way of saying this study could be extended by doing this, or the next step is to do that? You know, those are great pivot sentences to sort of pivot your way out of talking about a limitation or other issue in your analysis. You know, no study is going to completely deal with all of these things in one go. Okay, 5 more minutes. I still haven't, I'm not going to get through everything here. I think we may have to do some future sessions, but that's cool. So we've spoken, I guess, in the abstract about how to do, you know, some of this stuff for writing papers. How do we go about the mechanics of writing our manuscript? And, you know, here's something to think about. You know, what does the perfect first draft look like? And I think different people will have very different answers to this question. In my observation, it's a fairly common phenomenon for people to want to make something almost perfect before sending it to anybody else, especially their supervisor, who might be glaring at them. And they want the thing to be perfect, more or less, before it goes off. And of course, this is going to vary from lab to lab and from collaborator to collaborator. Here's what I think a perfect first draft is like. It's imperfect, first of all. It's incomplete. A draft is a draft, right? The clue is in the word draft, which means it's not finished. It's not complete. Think about it as a stem cell, right? The draft could turn into a number of different things. If you try to write something that is already complete, you're actually shutting down possibilities for how that paper might evolve and how it might emerge. Now, I recognize this may vary among collaborators. So if you're in a position where your supervisor or collaborators want something that's fully, you know, complete, that's up to them, and that, you know, you have to have that conversation and you have to work within your setting. I think a good first draft should be relatively open. It should outline what you're trying to do. It should definitely have a fairly decent statement of the results. You may have the results section even fairly well structured and drafted out, so that that draft shows what the results are, because the results are central, of course, to any paper. You know, that's your discovery, is your results. But that needs to be pretty fully worked out. But you may be unsure of exactly how to bring the logic together, and that's okay. And if you have a draft that pulls together several of these different sections, you can use that as the basis for a discussion. I always think of the first draft as a stem cell. The paper could go in develop in a number of different directions from that first draft. I think a good first draft should be written fairly soon after you do the analysis. I think often, I don't know about you, I find I'm most excited at that first moment of discovery, when you first see the result of a statistical test, or, you know, the plot of some data, and it's the moment of discovery. And that's the most exciting part, I think, of science. That excitement fades away pretty quick during the writing up phase. So I encourage you to sort of strike while the iron's hot and go begin writing a draft pretty quickly as you're analysing the results. And, you know, critically focus that, first of all, on your discovery. It's centred around the results, and even if you're not sure about the logic for the rest of it. Very practical, but I find very useful and important point. be very tidy and keep track of versions of your manuscript as it starts building up. I often find something very simple, like a very simple numbering system, really helps. So here you can see a paper that's on its 3rd revision so far. By the way, I typically find papers need about 15 rounds of revision before they're, at least it's not uncommon for papers to need that many rounds of revision before they're ready for submission. Here you can see a paper that's in its 3rd round currently. The first round was, the first version was sent round and 2 people have provided comments on it, and they've been labelled there with those co-authors' initials. And then the lead author has made a version 2 that incorporates those comments on version 1. And the beauty of this kind of system is that it keeps everything in a very nice order that's sort of chronological. It allows you to go back to any previous version and clearly see who said what in response to which particular version of it. If you deleted something between version 2 and version 1, you can go back to version 1 and take a look. You could always do a document compare. You can find that paragraph that you deleted if you wanted to reinstate it later on. So I encourage you to sort of, maybe not this system, but some kind of system to keep all of the versions of the paper as you're developing it, and organise everything so that you can easily go back to any particular part of it. Oh, this is really exciting stuff, but we're going to have to, I think I'm going to have to stop here. I'd really like to continue, but I don't want to, because I think I want to keep the sessions roughly the same length. And actually, I think we'll have some more sessions at a later date. So I apologise for that. I'm going to finish here. And then on the Facebook page, we shall announce further sessions in future. It won't be very long, in about a couple of weeks' time. I have a few more sort of points to make around dealing with co-authors and how we write papers collaboratively, and I don't want to rush through those. The Facebook page is our lab website, our lab Facebook page, so I'm just putting that into the chat, facebook.com/fullerlab. Join us there. And I will send around through the same channels I use for this one, updates so that you can see when the next sessions are going to be. Also, there's a YouTube channel where these talks are going up, so hopefully you can see them there. All right, thanks everyone for joining, and sorry, I told you it was going to be disorganized and I stuck to my word, and we shall revisit and continue this at a later date. So thank you everyone for joining. I shall finish the session there. Thanks everyone.